Good evening and welcome to this Ian Ramsey Center Humane Philosophy Project seminar. This is the last seminar of the Hillary term. However, you can find all the recordings of the previous talk and also the schedule for next term on the Ian Ramsey Center website and on the Humane Philosophy Project website, which I have behind me. And which is www.humanephilosophy.com. And the Ian Ramsey Center website is www.ianramseycenter.com. And I'll hand over to my colleague Ralph Weir to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikolaj. So this evening's speaker is Professor David Brown of the University of St Andrews. Professor Brown was educated at Edinburgh, Oxford and Cambridge. He taught here at Oxford for 14 years, at Durham for 17 years, before becoming Professor of Theology, Aesthetics and Culture at the University of St Andrews. I was saying before today's event that most of universities don't have a professorship in Theology, Aesthetics and Culture, but the world would be a better place if they did, of course. Professor Brown is also a professorial fellow of the St Andrews Institute for Theology, the Imagination and the Arts, and I think very much the same comment applies to that institution as well. So clearly he's someone with great affinities in his thought to the Humane Philosophy Project, and today he's going to talk to us about the arts critique of theology, so please give him a very warm welcome.
Well, many thanks indeed for that welcome. Can those in the back hear me okay? So, arts critique of theology. Although some academics attempt to cross disciplines and do so with real enthusiasm, most have a natural and understandable preference for the simpler course of truly mastering the areas they know best. Indeed, in a world of increasing specialization, it's common for such boundaries to be set within particular disciplines, with historians, for example, making the familiar response, "It's not my period," or theologians observing that doctrine and not Bible is their own area of competence. Equally, with the increasingly conceptually precise nature of philosophy, it often sounds like a terrain excluded even to those who once read the subject. So difficult is it to break easily into some sort of understanding of the new, more technical kinds of argument. Indeed, so austere are some specialism that one is tempted sometimes to speculate whether the student starting out now on a particular subject has a better sense of the overall state of their chosen discipline than do any of the learned teachers who address them. However, in the case of theology, such natural inclinations towards self-containment are aided and abetted by a unique feature of the discipline, that it claims in some sense to speak on behalf of God. As custodians of divine revelation, it would seem that nothing could possibly come from outside and stand as a corrective to what has been unveiled or disclosed by God. While such a stance might have been expected from conservative theologians, in actual fact, often even otherwise quite liberal theologians take a similar position, insisting that what they say, for instance, on sexual morality is derived from biblical principles rather than, at least in part, through influence from the secular culture. That way, of course, the supreme authority of Scripture is maintained, but one wonders at what cost in terms of a realistic appreciation of how, in fact, change has come about. But those wider issues are not my concern here. Rather, what I want to do in this lecture is focus on Christians' theology's relation to the arts. The last couple of decades had seen a real blossoming of literature on the subject, especially in relation to poetry, visual art, and music. Yet whether the writer be Catholic or Protestant, liberal or conservative, there has been what seems to me a surprising reluctance to admit that the traffic might go, as it were, in both directions. Instead, discussion has been dominated by what might be labeled exemplarism, the use of criteria drawn from theology to pronounce a particular work of art as good of its kind or not. Its role is thus seen to be at most to enhance belief, not help create it. It is that position which I wish to challenge in this lecture by exploring 4 commonly held assumptions about the world in which we now live. All 4 are widely believed to undermine the reasonableness of religious belief, whereas I shall contend that if theologians were to pay more attention to the arts, they would see the arts as their natural allies. Inevitably, not everything can be covered in a single lecture, so for simplicity's sake, in what follows, I will without further ado assume the truth of these 4 widely held positions. And I do so aware that the person presiding this evening would wish to challenge immediately one of them. Although I speak primarily as a theologian, the point is equally applicable to philosophers who write on religion. A wider vision that includes the arts could ensure a more balanced assessment of the appropriate impact of contemporary philosophical writing. Now, am I going at the right pace for everyone? Right. So, assumption 1, the collapse of dualism and the appeal instead to metaphor. One major problem that contemporary philosophical reflection poses for any attempt to bridge the gap between God and human beings is the fact that few intellectuals now believe in the conception of ourselves that dominated most of Christian history and which we inherited from Platonism, and that is the sense of us already inhabiting 2 worlds. Technically known as dualism, it spoke of human beings as consisting of 2 substances, mortal bodies and immortal souls, and thus of us inhabiting both the visible earth as the home of matter and an invisible reality that is the home of minds, ours and God's. Instead, we have been returned to what also is the more common but not universal biblical picture of us as psychosomatic unities, mind and body entirely interdependent, with us only surviving death, if at all, thanks to divine action, and not because of anything inherent in the way we have been made. If such a conclusion excludes any sense of us already linked to heaven, the invisible world that is God's, the question then, of course, becomes acute of whether there might be an alternative way of making that connection. I would suggest that reflection on the world of the arts provides just such a possibility through appeal to the imagination. That is, an appeal no longer to the fundamental nature of our minds, but rather to how those minds work. Human beings learn the use of words in application to the sensible world. So clearly, if the jump to the divine is to be made, languages will need to be stretched in analogies, images, and metaphors, what are in effect the common tools of the imagination. Perhaps the relevance of the point to all the imaginative arts can be expressed most clearly by making explicit the parallel between symbol in action, metaphor in writing, and image in the visible arts, and how the theological notion of sacramentality is based on a similar structure. Consider first the traditional sacraments. Each involves an action that by doing one thing intends another. The consecration of bread and wine to become the body and blood of Christ, the exchange of rings to establish a permanent relation between two individuals, the anointing of a dying person's body to prepare for life in another world, and so on. Works of the imagination, irrespective of the medium, appear very similarly founded. The metaphors of the poet are intended to take us from one sphere of discourse to another. The images of the artist from one visual image to another, or sometimes quite outside the visual altogether. While a medium like ballet is full of symbolic acts, under which gestures of the body are intended to imply acts performed quite differently in ordinary life. Even prior to his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism in 1927, T.S. Eliot had already detected the importance of metaphor in helping to interconnect what otherwise might seem an unintegrated, uncreated world. Thus, in a famous essay on the metaphysical poets, he observes, quoting, "When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating disparate experiences. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The latter, the poet falls in love or reads Spinoza, the former, the non-poet, falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other, or with the noise of the typewriter, or the smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, however, these experiences are always forming new wholes." In other words, then, as symbol is to action, metaphor is to language, and image to art, so sacrament is to religion. Each is trying to move us analogically, to take us to a different place, and so establish new wholes. Of course, in most uses of the imagination, that other place remains firmly in our present world. Nonetheless, the imagination has already accepted the principle of a move elsewhere. And so it may well be asked, why not then to a vastly different world, and so to the realm of God? As Jesus' use of parables illustrates, or some of the extraordinary imagery and wordplay found in the prophets, similes and metaphors, when well used, can draw us from the material world into quite a different order of existence. As already noted, this is not at all to claim that every exercise of the imagination even implicitly evokes God, but it is to observe that the imagination is deploying precisely the same kind of tools that make talk of God possible. So, however hostile to faith individual artists may be, they are at least moving humanity onto the same terrain that legitimates talk of God. The sacramental can thus be seen to build upon the symbolic and metaphorical, inasmuch as though the latter are not sacramental as such, it's not hard to see how the process which they utilize might extend to the more explicitly sacramental participation of one thing in another, where too there is both similarity and difference, as in, say, earthly light taking us to heavenly light, or running water to living water, as in John 4, and so on. Indeed, that very fact of difference that is opened up in analogical language and action helps to identify another key contribution that the imagination can make towards an encounter with the divine, and that is the essentially open-ended character of all imagery and symbol. That's to say, the interpretation of such devices can be pulled in quite a number of different directions, and so the question of an alternative religious world can be raised even when such a thought was far removed from the intention of the artist or speaker. This is because once we move beyond the literal, the multivalent character of possible comparative illusions cannot be strictly controlled. And indeed, one might argue that it is the mark of a great poet or artist to welcome such elusive richness, pointing in more than one direction. So the transition to the immaterial can sometimes be imaginatively made, even where such thoughts were far from the creator's mind, and perhaps even from most of his audience or viewers. So to give a visual example, it seems to me that some of Francis Bacon's paintings, although atheist in intent, actually can help move our minds in the direction of God. I can expand on that claim afterwards, or to give a literary example, think of A.E. Housman's poem, If in a Syrian Garden, a non-believer writing with skepticism about the resurrection. Christ is still in his grave, that's the first verse. The second verse says, well, even if you're in heaven, you're a total waste of time because you're not doing anything. And so it ends with the injunction, bow hither out of heaven and see and save. His point being that's precisely what Christ doesn't do. But what's more moving than, as I've often experienced in the liturgy for Holy Saturday, singing those verses and entering into the expectation of the change that Easter Day brings. So a non-believer used to transform a Christian's experience. Now, the above to some might seem and suggest a purely subjective viewpoint. But while obviously some interpretations might be strained, this is hardly to concede that this inevitably happens when there's deviation from the majority interpretation. And perhaps one might be allowed to use a poem on the relation between poetry and religion to itself express such an account. One by the contemporary Australian poet Les Murray, who I think perfectly captures this relation between poetry and religion. Full religion is the large poem in loving repetition, and God is the poetry caught in any religion. Caught, not imprisoned. Caught as in a mirror that is attracted, being in the world as poetry is in the poem, a law against closure. So recent proposals to restore the right hemisphere of the brain to the more central place that it is by nature, as in the neurologist Ian McGilchrist's influential book, The Master and His Emissary, might suggest something deep about how God has made us, with the poetic and the imaginative at the heart of who we are, because it makes possible this strong link with divine, non-material reality, despite the fact that we are fundamentally material beings. It would endorse also the speculation of child psychologists like Bettelheim and Piaget, who make the imagination central to child development, and thus also pick up on much 18th century philosophy, such as in Herder and Hamann, for whom poetry, quoting Hamann, is the native tongue of the human race. In other words, we learn first through the imagination, through our poetic sensibilities, before we move to reason. And there's a point to that. So that's the end of my first point, the collapse of dualism and the turn to metaphor. Secondly, the collapse of theistic arguments for God's existence, and a turn to religious experience. When precisely the need for proofs of God's existence came to dominate philosophical discussion, and what were the main impulses for such a way of seeing things, is a matter of some contention among intellectual historians. 3 significant books in this connection are Michael Buckley's At the Origin of Modern Atheism, Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and Michael Gillespie's The Theological Origins of Modernity. Although they differ greatly over when precisely change set in, their common contention is that the problem begins when religious belief comes to be seen as an inference from something else, rather than itself directly experienced as part of the air we breathe, as it were. Charles Taylor wants to blame the Reformation when there ceased to be a common culture, but one might equally well go back as far as Aquinas with his 5 proofs for God's existence. And I apologize for these comments in a Dominican house. Although modern attempts to disengage Thomas from later neo-Thomism of the kind typified by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange are largely successful, the new influence from Aristotle that Aquinas made possible did after all have considerable impact in generating demands for a rational structure whereby God in effect becomes an inference rather than part of immediate human experience. Surprisingly, such a view even became part of the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church in the 19th century. Yet even most contemporary Christian philosophers would now concede that such contentions were considerably overblown. Bridging the gap between the empirical world and the divine in this way, by strict deductive argument, was simply not the right way of going about things. Inevitably, the decline in acceptance of the traditional proofs has brought with it much interest in religious experience, with appeal to such experience now itself sometimes structured as a new form of proof. And indeed, I myself have engaged in such presentations. Here, however, I want my focus to be somewhat different. Although all such discussion has kept well clear of potential overlaps with aesthetic experience, and it may seem that this was a wise intuition, I would like to suggest otherwise, not only because religious experience is thereby unnecessarily, much religious experience is thereby necessarily excluded, but also because much of the appropriate terminology for religious experience is first learnt in aesthetic contexts. Of course, the analysis of experience would be much simpler if religious experience always occurred in contexts quite separate from the aesthetic. But in actual fact, quite frequently there are interconnections, with initial religious responses, for example, clarified and deepened by subsequent aesthetic encounters and the kind of language and increased perceptivity that they now make possible. So, for example, one thinks of the increased awareness that painters such as Constable or Friedrich make available in their landscapes. Constable, with his sensitivity to divine immanence in scenes such as those surrounding Dedham Church or Salisbury Cathedral, or Friedrich with his so-called Rückenfiguren that invite us to a similar perception to those figures with their backs to us, of the divine transcendence implicit in the majestic landscape that they observe. In other words, my point here is that you start with an inchoate experience of God mediated through landscape. These paintings, they'll then help you to clarify what your experience and deepen it. Equally, one can see the process at work in the opening lines of familiar poems, such as Gerard Manley Hopkins' God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. Hopkins' suggestion is of an immediate experience, and as such this is contrasted with the effect of trade, under which trees come only to be valued for their timber and not in their own right. So nature is viewed purely instrumentally, with some further purpose in mind, and not intrinsically, just as it is in itself, as a divine creation. It is that alternative perception to which Hopkins is trying to restore us, and it's by reading his poem that we have this stronger sense of God present in nature, and which he argues was lost as people grow up influenced by trade, but more widely culturally lost when sacramentality's connection with Platonism was abandoned, with its true primary metaphors of participation and imitation that suggests nature and humanity already in some sense bridging the two domains of earthly and heavenly realities. To the objection that all such connections are imposed and not discovered, there is of course a long tradition of an alternative explanation, of a learnt culture blinding us to the link. It is to culture's wider deceptive power that Hopkins is here pointing, an insight that he shared with Britain's greatest art critic of the 19th century, John Ruskin, part of whose counter-strategy was to bring nature and art into closer relation. In Ruskin's view, human art was at its best with imitating nature, principally because nature as a divine creation itself brought us closer to the ultimate source of all creativity. Indeed, despite his Calvinist roots, Ruskin insists that nature does not merely point to God, but can itself provide experience of the divine nature. So, for example, a seascape stretching to infinity is said not just to point to the possibility of a similar infinity in God, it actually allows for the possibility to experience such infinity as one of the divinity's own distinctive attributes. In Ruskin's own words, quoting, "Light receding in the distance is of all visible things the least material, the least finite, the furthest withdrawn from the earth, the most typical of the nature of God, the most suggestive of the glory of his dwelling place." So one moves from seeing the light receding to an experience of God. While that makes him sound very similar to many of his predecessors writing on the sublime, in fact, 6 different types of beauty are distinguished by Ruskin, each of which has the capacity, he suggests, to mediate a particular divine attribute: infinity or incomprehensibility, unity or comprehensiveness, repose or permanence, symmetry or justice, purity or energy, and moderation or restraint. We haven't the time to go through all of these, but for example, repose or permanence, he suggests, is conjured up in Scripture's description of the everlasting hills. It is often said that such attitudes to nature cannot survive the discoveries of Darwin. But even though the strength of Ruskin's certainty of such an intimate connection between nature and God was severely tested by Darwin's new theories, it is by no means clear why this should have been so. Strange creatures that had anticipated human beings were already known to the biblical authors in the form of Behemoth and Leviathan, and so far from finding them repulsive, an author like Job can detect God's delight in such variety of forms. More recently, a poetic writer like Annie Dillard, in her classic meditation of 1976, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, well illustrates how even direct confrontation with nature red in tooth and claw need not undermine such a sense of divine presence within nature. While frankly confessing her perplexity at nature at its most brutal and wasteful, as with the giant water bug and praying mantis, she insists on refusing such encounters' divine decisive sway. Instead, they are held in creative tension with how nature appears elsewhere, with its author at once a spendthrift genius and someone who displays extravagance of care. In other words, argument remains, in her view, the wrong category in which to view the symbols of creation. We can experience God directly in nature, even if at times our encounters are quite the reverse. And of course, it's not only nature that can be experienced sacramentally in this way. Much of human experience can similarly function, as for example, when human love acts as a cipher for divine love. In such ideas on nature, Ruskin was almost certainly influenced by Wordsworth, even his favourite term, types, being one such borrowing. But it's important to note that it was not just aesthetic experience of nature that he saw as helping to engender religious experience. He also makes much the same a point about works of art such as poetry, painting, and architecture, with expressions of infinity in a painting, for example, capable of occasioning a similar experience of divine infinity. At this point, objections are likely to come from both sides of the religious divide, questioning the possibility of such experience, but for quite different reasons. Thus, on the one hand, some Catholic philosophers of religion, such as Brian Davis and Dennis Turner, have queried what it could possibly mean to say that an individual had had an experience of God, given the kind of attributes divinity is supposed to possess. But worries on this score seem to me exaggerated, since even in our ordinary human encounters with one another, most experience is aspectival and inferential. It's built up gradually. That's to say, we build up interpretive frames rather than receive them in a single, all-encompassing instance. So Turner and Davis are just demanding too much, even of human experience. Equally misconstrued, as is my view, is the objection from the other side, that such alleged religious experience through the arts are merely questionable inferences drawn from the more basic aesthetic experience. Not only is such an inferential way of talking not how the religious experience is characteristically described, but also even non-believers exploring such experience often find themselves identifying a further layer where a religious interpretation is seen as in some way the more natural reading, even though for them it must be resisted. A good case in point is the distinguished music critic Wilfrid Mellor's exploration of the sort of music that he saw as engendering such descriptions in his book called Celestial Music. His view is not that religious believers have confused the aesthetic and the religious. Rather, it is that a distinctive type of experience beyond the aesthetic has been correctly identified, but that it is deceptive if its pull to any sense of an objective encounter with divine reality is accepted. At most, what is on offer is spiritual uplift. So he accepts the legitimacy of this alternative category. So my response here is that we ought to take aesthetic experience as a way of mediating religious experience much more seriously. So now on to number 3, social conditioning and communication through images. With the third area I want to mention, it is a claim that is perhaps more prominent in those influenced by continental than English analytic philosophy. That is the whole issue of cultural conditioning. the way in which, even despite ourselves, we are caught up in the cultural assumptions of our time. Among analytic philosophers, perhaps best known commenting on this phenomenon are the works of Richard Rorty and Alistair MacIntyre, but more characteristic perhaps would be contribution of people like the Frankfurt School or French philosophers such as Michel Foucault. However that may be, the dominant response for claims to such cultural conditioning in any form from many of the 20th century's most important theologians have been strongly hostile, to insist on the radical otherness of biblical revelation, as in the language of the early Barth, of the Bible being, quoting him, like a flash of lightning, as the dissolution of all relativity. It was a position that Barth modified in later life with his talk of secular parables, but even then he was cautious, as his correspondence with the writer Karl Zuckmayer indicates. But the problem in any case with any such answer is twofold. First, it flies in the face of facts. We're now all too aware of the wider cultural influence upon ourselves, and of a similar pattern holding in Scripture. But secondly, unless God in his revelation builds on the way human beings are actually situated, as conditioned, it's hard to see why its message should have any relevance to socially conditioned beings like ourselves. From that concession, it would be all too easy to draw a purely negative inference, that we're thereby bound to adopt some form of determinism, and with it the relativism of all ideas. But conditioning emphatically does not mean that human beings cannot take any steps beyond the times in which they live. Otherwise, how would new ideas be possible? What it does mean is that any such overstepping must bear some relation to where the society as a whole has already reached in its reflections. Even so, the most common response from theologians remains one of anxiety, that to speak of the Bible in this way as conditioned, however qualified, is to undermine its claim to contain a divine message that transcends particular times and places. Equally, philosophers have more often than not concluded on the opposite side, as with Jürgen Habermas in his theory of communicative action and later writings, that such severe conditioning reduces the possibility of theology making any significant contribution to any wider attempt at enlightenment convergence of ideas. It is here that the contribution of the imagination and of its accompanying images can once more come to the rescue. For it's important to note that no biblical text stands on its own, but is rather part of a continuing tradition of interpretation. Thus, as the existence of duplicate narratives demonstrates, evident even from the first 3 chapters of the Bible, new ways of telling foundational stories arise, as do fresh treatments of particular metaphors and symbols. It is thus quite untrue that present context alone shapes meaning in the Bible. Instead, what we have is a meaning that, as prior to present context and subsequent to it, can also be, at least to a degree, transcendent of particular place and time. Indeed, this can also help explain why close attention to earlier strands of tradition can bring its own distinctive spiritual rewards. The interest lies not in the fact that those earlier strands somehow are, as already transcendent realities, escaped conditioning, but rather that, because of being part of a tradition, they can preserve insights that may have been distorted or lost through later handling of the same images or symbols. Equally, such an appeal to a tradition of imaginative symbols can also help us deal with the more limited or kenotic understanding of Christ consciousness that has been forced upon us by conclusions in biblical scholarship. Here again, it might look initially as though the new way of seeing things presents a major challenge to the transcendence of Jesus and his message. But another way of reading that same evidence is to say that he now becomes more effectively a saviour by sharing in precisely the same sort of conditioning that humanity in general endures. Moreover, although Jesus was born into such a very specific culture and time, because it was part of a developing tradition, a whole host of imaginative ideas were available to him as he was growing up that would not have been present, or not present to the same degree, in earlier generations and in other parts of the world. Among them, for example, the suffering servant, the kingdom of God, the Passover lamb, and so on. One theologian who made much of this fact was Austin Farrer in his pioneering 1948 work, The Glass of Vision. For Farrer, such imagery became the primary vehicle of revelation, with Jesus creatively shaping the imagery he had inherited to his own unique sense of mission. If that is so, to adopt post-Vatican II's talk of Christ as sacrament would be to speak of Jesus drawing on the images and metaphors of his time to help bridge the two worlds, human and divine, in a way that allowed not only his own real creative participation in both worlds, but also a similar participation for those who came after him, as the images continue to acquire new resonances and meaning. So the total effect of conditioning is overcome by the fact that the Bible and subsequent history is set in the context of a tradition that is powerful, more powerful than any particular moment of time or place. Then, finally, limits of human knowledge and complementary image. The final modern change of perspective to which I wish to draw attention, where the arts might be relevant to theology, is on the question of limits to human knowledge. Kant provided a famous positive spin on his assertion of such limits by asserting in the Critique of Pure Reason that he was abolishing knowledge to make room for faith. Many theologians who have followed Kant have ended up, however, with what can only be described as a very minimal version of Christianity. That's not my intention here, not least since Kant's standards for knowledge can themselves be questioned. What I want to do instead is set side by side the continuing theological search for a very tight conceptual system enshrined in the terminology that has now largely replaced Christian doctrine, terms such as dogmatic theology, systematic theology, or its most recent variant, analytic theology. Set that on one side, and how poets and artists have in fact treated the stories and metaphors that they have inherited from the Christian tradition. The intention, I must emphasize, is not as a way of reducing ontological commitments. Christ's divinity, for example, can, in my view, be proclaimed no less effectively in a powerful metaphor or in the symbolism of a particular painting as in any more straightforward assertion of the fact. Rather, my point is that not all elaborations into system are necessarily an advantage. Implausible premises may be required to keep the whole thing together, whereas left at the level of complementary metaphors, mutual enrichment may be the net result. That is to say, put more bluntly, sometimes there may well be a category mistake involved in pushing the language of the imagination, the metaphors and other images of revelation, too far in the direction of a more narrowly defined concept, and that is what may well explain some of the less profitable disputes that have occurred in the history of theology. Take, for example, the doctrine of the atonement, how we're reconciled to God through Christ. Conventional histories talk of the dominance of different theories at different periods of history, but still on the assumption that one theory must necessarily give place to another. Well, that's how theories operate. But why should we think of the Christus Victor approach of Luther as necessarily an alternative to Athanasius' sacrificial account, or even of Anselm's satisfaction theory as requiring to be placed in opposition to Calvin's view? Admittedly, in some cases, there is a formal logical structure, most obviously so in the past in the case of Anselm's Cur Deus Homo, of why God became man, but there is no shortage of examples from more recent times as well in many a philosopher and theologian. But the more interesting question, in my view, is whether the defensible element in all these theories, in inverted commas, lies in their formal structure or in the imagery, and whether it has been appropriately applied or not. If their strength lies in the imagery, then it could be the case that the apparently opposing elements of imagery could actually be used to complement one another rather than be brought into conflict. After all, the key thing about metaphor is that not every aspect of it is true, and so apparent conflict need not imply actual. And that's one way of reading the New Testament, where a great range of images are used without any apparent sense of opposition. These include, example, penalty, ransom, rescue, sacrifice, salvation, satisfaction, substitution, victory. Indeed, that very variety is one reason why this approach was adopted the last time the Church of England's Doctrine Commission was asked to report on atonement in 1995. Nor, it should be noted, is this to say that necessarily we now know less about the atonement than was once thought. In terms of tight formal argument, this is no doubt true, but so far from the metaphors cancelling each other out, one has every reason to believe that an enrichment of understanding would be the net result if careful attention is given to the metaphor's mutual complementarity. Thus, sacrifice and satisfaction, judgment and moral stimulation, and so on. As a matter of fact, no particular version of the atonement was ever officially sanctioned by the Church. Even so, the attempt by theologians to advance particular theories did generate major problems for the Church, as, for example, with penal substitution. So the retreat from formal argument to complementary image could certainly lead not only to enrichment of vision, but also to a more irenic discussion. One other example which may help. Much post-war discussion of the doctrine of the Trinity has been dominated by two rival models for understanding. One structured in terms of a society of persons, the other as a matter of internal relations within a single person. Early in my career, I wrote in favour of a social model, but as the years have advanced, I've also shown some sympathy for the other model. Either it was writing on artistic images for the Trinity that has led me to question whether either model could ever offer the complete truth. More recently, Sarah Coakley has written also on artistic images, but at somewhat greater length. However, our two approaches are quite different. Coakley comes to the images with certain advanced expectations and measure the images in their light, as, for instance, in her insistence on images of the Spirit being of comparable size to the other two persons, and the father-son relationship being less obviously gendered so as to be more effective in including women in relationship to God. My interest was rather in what the artist did with the existing tradition, the other way round in other words, and so the related possibility that they might actually have something useful to teach theologians. Like Coakley, artists were often concerned to produce a more adequate image for the spirit, but their desire to remain loyal to the existing tradition of representation meant that in general they adopted an alternative solution to the problem of presenting the spirit's equality visually. Instead, the spirit remained as a dove, but was now allowed to preside either in the center, with the other two persons either side, as in a famous painting by Titian, or else floating above them both, as in another famous painting by Dürer. As a result, the order of begetting and possessing may well have been forgotten, but in defense one may observe that a single image is unlikely to be able to say everything about the Trinity within a single frame. More pertinent here, though, is how artists have approached the two rival models mentioned above. For what one soon discovers that any accurate matching of one model against one particular form of representation is impossible. Let's consider first paintings in which the three Trinitarian persons are represented as some kind of society. What quickly becomes apparent is that what is actually primarily being expressed is their relations to one another, rather than them simply as three. So, for example, in the famous Gnadenstuhl or mercy seat images that were hugely popular over several centuries, what we find is the Father sitting on the mercy seat of the Old Covenant as he holds the exposed crucified Son lovingly in his arms, with the Spirit as dove hovering between them as the indispensable link between them both. While thus failing to correspond completely with the creedal version of the divine relations, it's nonetheless clearly on relations that the image is primarily focused, with the choice of symbols secondary to those relations. In other words, the point is the divine unity in the decision of the cross. Equally, in cases where a single identity is stressed in imagery, as where you might make comparisons with the repeated affirmations of the same attributes in the Athanasian Creed, more often than not what we find is that a single image is actually pulling to a more corporate or societal form. Certainly this seems the intention where three identical mysterious human forms are presented, but it's equally true where there's only one single form, human form, but with three heads. Such images are frequently misunderstood, and not only in our own day. In 15th century Florence, St. Antoninus, the bishop of the time, led a campaign against them. This is a single, three heads joined as one. He led a campaign against such images on the ground that they were contra naturam, contrary to nature. He did not quite succeed in eliminating them all, as some have survived to this day, even from his own day, as in a famous painting by Andrea del Sarto. But a great irony lies in the fact that the advocates of such images, so far from being worried by the contra nature objection, would almost certainly have taken the comment as a compliment, since that was precisely their primary aim, to assert that the Trinity is going beyond anything we can learn from nature. Perhaps the point can be made clearer by looking at comparable images in the pre-Christian pagan world. There, it is not just gods in human shape to which this reduplication of form is applied, but also those of animal appearance, an additional horn, for example, being provided if you've got a bull. The aim was thus, I suggest, primarily intended to indicate intensifying power, that is, more than animal, more than human. So similarly then, in the Christian context, the attempt was meant to imply the more than purely human, the inadequacy of any analogue at all with a single human mind. Of course, that does not necessarily entail more than one mind, but it does call into question any notion that the divine mind and human mind are in any obvious sense comparable. So the 1-1 attempt just won't do. In short, it looks as though reflection on artistic images for the Trinity might lead one to question whether there is any absolute opposition between the two types of approach that have dominated discussion since the Second World War. Rather, neither is adequate on its own to the task. Both analogies will inevitably fail at some point precisely because that's what analogies do. But rather than lamenting the fact, we should acknowledge some merits in each of the two alternative approaches, for the divine mind just doesn't follow either pattern. Instead, whichever analogy we start with, it will still need some complementing by its opposite. And so to my conclusion. What I've sought to argue in considering these four common assumptions in contemporary philosophy is that theology need not be afraid of any alleged consequences, provided, that is, it takes seriously the arts as one of its potential partners. And in making that claim, I also intend to suggest that philosophers who write about religion also need to be more widely alert to such a potential contribution, since God is mediated not just through the revelation that is inherent in Scripture and in formal philosophical reflections, but in all the ways our minds work, including the imagination and the undoubted contribution that the imagination can bring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown, for a deeply inspiring and exciting talk. We now have time for questions. So I see Andrew Pinsent already raising his hand. If you could wait until the microphone gets to you before you start addressing your question, and Nella will bring the microphone to you when I point you out. So Andrew Pinsent first, and then we have a question at the back.
Thank you very much. It was an inspiring talk. There's one theme I didn't hear that I thought would come in at least 3 points. So the theme of grace. Grace as nature transformed or transfigured. And the reason why I thought that was going to come in is because, first of all, in art. So 1,000 years of art in the Western tradition was not just about painting nature and seeing God, but painting the concretely given supernatural and seeing God. So you got the incarnation, you got the saints, and so on. By the time you get to the 19th century, the saints have largely been taken out, and you just got landscapes. So there's the grace element missing. When you talk about Catholic theology in the 19th century affirming the proofs of God's existence, I'd like to add a nuance, because they did affirm the existence of God qua nature, not qua grace, not qua the Trinity. And again, Aquinas says the same. You can't prove the Trinity. So there's a distinction there, again, where the grace would help. And then the final point about that not everything beyond nature could automatically be good, of course. And here again, grace is an important issue, because I think you've got two strands in the Western tradition. You've got the supernatural, as understood as grace transforming nature, but you also got Nietzsche's version of the Superman. You've got the desire for power, and so I think the bishop was right to be cautious about some images of the Trinity. Thank you.
Well, there's rather a lot there, so I don't think I can answer it all. In defense of my critique of St. Antoninus, I think he was too heavily influenced by the Renaissance. I mean, you're quite right that not all going beyond nature are good, but I think he becomes so influenced by the Renaissance painting round about that he thought it has to be natural, and so that's what's going wrong there. On the question of grace, I think ever since I was an undergraduate. I think I've been persuaded by Rana on the subject of grace. And if you remember, Rana said that nature is, in German, a Restbegriff, a remainder concept. So nature is an artificial construct because God is always there, addressing us and in our world. And so it's not that you have to bring him in, and that's one of the great mistakes that Catholic theology made at one point in its history in strongly separating. So in terms of Constable's painting and Friedrich and so on, I'd want to say grace is already there, and they're detecting God at work in nature. So that would be the position I'd adopt.
Father White, Professor, thank you for your talk. There were a lot of very profound and erudite points, and I was very sympathetic to many of the positive proposals you gave regarding art. And I think that actually from those within the Catholic tradition, they would not be controversial points in many ways. At least many of your positive proposals are things that Catholics would take for granted. But I think from that point of view also, one would wonder if you posed a number of unnecessary oppositions. I mean, it was interesting to me that you sort of argued against thinking about the immateriality of the soul, which, by the way, Catholics would never call dual substances. That's a condemned heresy of the Catholic Church. We're only one substance, even if there's an immortal soul informing the body. But that's not in opposition to thinking artistically about how the spiritual life enriches the perception of material forms, or how spiritual life plays out through human playfulness in the senses. And so, likewise, with your second point, the answer to the problem of demonstrations of the existence of God in classical metaphysics is to retreat to art. But on the other hand, I mean, the Catholic tradition traditionally sees these as mutually enriching. It might be very difficult for many people to come to a clear sort of set of metaphysical views about the world, and especially God. But I mean, that's why we have art, to help us lift up the mind to that direction. I mean, it seems to me the Catholic tradition has held a better kind of poise about avoiding oppositions between a kind of Swiss kind of austerity of conceptuality against icons versus a kind of an artistic standpoint that I would wonder it doesn't lean a little towards the anti-intellectual or the anti-conceptual. If the Catholic Church holds these two things together successfully for so long, why can't we hold that model, some kind of both-and model of metaphysics and art?
So my intention was not to attack metaphysics, but to say that there are ways in which current metaphysical assumptions are thought to undermine Christian belief, but that is not necessarily the case if you think about artistic contributions, if you think along those lines. So I have no objection to continuing to write about philosophy of religion or whatever it is. So this is not as an alternative to metaphysics, it's pointing out how it can be enriched. I think, though, on your point about attitudes to the soul, I mean, you're quite right about what Aquinas says, but that is, of course, Aquinas isn't the only person who's written the history of the Catholic Church. So,
right, but the Council of Vienne has made it clear, I mean, at least for the last 500 years, it's been a clear, settled doctrine of the Catholic Church. There's only one substantial form.
I think you're now dealing with technicalities rather than the way in which people think. And then, in terms of perhaps there isn't a Mr. or Mrs. Average, but in terms of the way in which ordinary people think, it would be true that most Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant, if you'd asked in the 19th century, would have thought of themselves as having a soul that somehow hives off. I think that could be proved by reading ordinary literature. Now that's different from what the official teaching is, but I think if we looked at a mass of literature, you know, from in ordinary writing as to text from professional theologians, that would be the point that would emerge. And I'm not making a point particularly against Catholicism or anything, because it's equally true on the Protestant side. So the Westminster Confession, for example, one of its clauses says that all human beings have an immortal soul.
Well, I mean, I think that's a Catholic doctrine. I'm just saying, I think, I believe the soul hives off in that sense. I mean, it seems to me that one must believe it's the form of the body. And that's very different than if you think there are two things. The body and soul are two things.
Right, well the point I'm trying to get at, sorry, I think we're talking at cross purposes, is that most people think that there isn't anything that hives off, that that's an impossible metaphysical belief. So I'm saying, from the point of view of argument, let's assume that that's right. Where then do we go from there? And my point was, even if it is the case that there's nothing in us that can hive off, then there are still ways of making the connection between our materiality and God's, and that's where the arts come in. So that was the structure of my argument. Not to say you're wrong, but to say...
That's very clear. It just seems like you can't replace the integral metaphysical question of whether what's true. Right. I mean, whether your premise is true or not.
Right.
Question right up the front here, and then another two down.
Thank you for that. It was really rich. I've been trying to piece together potential links between maybe different categories that you might have, just to try and understand you better. There seem to be some links between narrative and sensation, and then something else between imagination and, well, maybe things in themselves. To me, if I understood you, narrativity is strongly associated with the aesthetic, but is it not also, or alternatively, associated with the sensory? And if it is, then, well, maybe that might cast into doubt some of your assertions about... Maybe that might cast into doubt some of your assertions about the role of the aesthetic. Secondly, narrativity is strongly associated with the imagination, but in your view, is it not also perhaps mind-independent narrativity? Is that not also something that is in your picture?
Well, I think that the arts address themselves to different sorts of things, and if we're talking about literary arts, then in the case of poetry, one key issue then is metaphor, simile, and so on. Narratives are a different kettle of fish, and they may have those, but they don't necessarily have those. But they are still ways of relating to something other than ourselves. So we often negotiate, just as we discover new things through metaphor. So a dramatic metaphor enables us to comprehend what we might not comprehend otherwise. So narratives can have that kind of function. So Jesus' parables is an obvious example. They tell stories that enable us to see ourselves in a different sort of way. But I think that's equally true of much more ordinary events. So one reason, it seems to me, for the popularity of soaps in Britain is that they're a way of people, ordinary people, trying to think into circumstances that they're finding problematic. So I've got a gay son, what am I to do? Then there's a story about that in EastEnders or something. But through thinking into narrative, that you manage to engage with alternative possibilities. So it seems to me that narrative like metaphor, can move us into a different world. So that's why I was thinking narrative was important.
Okay. Just I'll concede it to all of you.
Hello, thank you. I just wonder what you think about how we can experience, or someone can experience, the sacred by looking at by being in front of a painting which is completely abstract. For example, I'm thinking, for example, Kandinsky, or so what is it in there which is completely is not religious as such? It's just colors, and what happens there between the picture and the person that the experience can be religious?
Well, I think they, I seem to be losing my voice. I think they can move from one thing to another, from an aesthetic experience to a religious one. So if you think of, say, the paintings of Rothko and Newman, Barnett Newman, they're abstract paintings. They both thought that they had the power to evoke a sense of the divine as well as give an aesthetic experience. So the aesthetic experience might be in terms of the depth of the canvas. So with Rothko, a single colour that nonetheless turns out to be multiple shades, and so you have an experience of how wonderful a single colour can be. But then it also brings depth, and so it seems to pull you to something that says, well, the painting isn't the end of it. That's perhaps clearer in Barnett Newman's paintings, with the zip, you know, the narrow line in his paintings, and that's notion of unexplored possibilities. So you're looking at the surface, but you also say, there's something pulling you deeper. And it's certainly true if we turn to European abstract painting with some like Mondrian. So Mondrian began his life as a devout Calvinist, a son of a manse, and painting nature, but finding crucifixions and windmills and that kind of thing. But then he is influenced by theosophy to say that the world is, there are very simple principles on which God has founded the world. And so you simultaneously have the aesthetic experience of the simple structures of colour and rectangles that then pulls you, he hopes, to a realization that the world is fundamentally like this, that God has produced an extraordinary ordered but very simple world. And then he changed his mind, as you may know, at the end of his life with New York Boogie Woogie, where he then says, no, it's not like this, it's more like jazz, it's far more dynamic. I've discovered, and God's really, sounds almost patronizing to put it like this, he's more exciting or something. But you can see how it's a different experience from just saying, because he spent hours moving all these tiny little bits of paper and sticking them in different places and trying to get the colours matched. And your aesthetic experience is, gosh, hasn't he got those colours perfectly balanced, or whatever. But your religious experience is saying, no, he's saying something wonderful about the world and in turn about God.
We've got time for one or two more questions, but although I'm for a fact sure there are two questions burning here, we're happy to give them to the audience. So one there and then one more at the back, and we'll have to wrap up with that.
Right. Thank you for your very inspiring talk. In his book Faith and Wisdom in Science, Tom McLeish quotes George Steiner as saying, only art can go some way towards making accessible, towards waking into some measure of communicability the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. And what I found interesting was that, although he reaches the same conclusion about the indispensability of art, it's not to get us from human materiality to divine immateriality, but from human immateriality to the material world. So my question was, can art help us in both directions, from materiality to immateriality and the other way round?
Gosh, well, I think that's a deep question, but I'm not sure if I got an immediate answer. Can I think about it?
Thank you very much, Professor Brown, for that. So much in there. Actually, it was one of your kind of asides that got me thinking, and that was a comment about Father Garrigou-Lagrange. And I actually think Father Garrigou had a much more sacramental ontology of creation than did somebody like Father Chanou, who we would associate with ressourcement. But what it got me thinking about was metaphor. And whether, because we can see how metaphors, if you like, give us a boundaried way into unboundaried realities. For example, the passage of time as a metaphor that gives us a way of empirically modeling temporality. I wondered if the category of the sacrament might actually drive a process of reflection within the arts on the relationship between metaphoricity and literality. And whether actually we might come to see, if we want to have something more like a sacramental ontology, paradoxically such as Garrigou's, that we might actually want to consider metaphor as a kind of properly basic way of linguistically inhabiting the world, rather than a kind of literal, ostensive definition approach to language.
Well, again, that's perhaps I'm just getting tired, but again, I think that again is a deep question. And Paul Ricoeur's view was that all language is metaphorical. I'm not sure if that's true, but there's certainly a lot more around, and I think part of the problem is I think it would be a richer world if we were more aware of it when it is there. So dead metaphors can still actually be allowed more force than, and so on. I mean, I think that's also true in the way the sacraments are taught as well, that people can get used to them just being literal, rather than, and they see that as a way of defending them, when in fact their power is that they have this metaphorical base. And I think this is a problem that has dogged analytic philosophy, that getting to the literal is what really counts, whereas in my view, I think the metaphorical can actually contain the deeper truth, and you actually lose a huge amount by cashing it in, as it were. I mean, it's a very good book by Janet Soskis in defense of metaphor. But I think it's, I think this is a quite deep problem that we've got, that unless, I mean, it's a sort of attitude to a poem that once I know what it means, I can throw it aside. So now I've told you that what's meant by the reference to trade in God's grandeur, where you say, oh, well, I've got that poem, I don't have to read that one again. Whereas part of the point of the poem is the metaphors are such and the rhythm is such that you're drawn into an experience that you won't be drawn into if you just translate it as prose. And that'd be true of something like music. I mean, you need to hear pieces again and again, and they become richer. I remember when I moved to Durham from Oxford, I was still at that stage very much 19th century and onwards lover of music, And I then found I had to listen to 16th century church music day after day. Initially I thought, dreadful, oh dear, do I have to do this? And then, you know, the longer you did it, the more you began to get into it. And then you realize, no, you can't do without it. You gain something. But this is, I think, equally true of poetry and all the arts. You know, this is why people go back again and again to, not obviously the Bible if we're Christians, but to great works of literature. You know, why people read War and Peace a dozen times, or, you know, the sort of person who reads all 6 novels of Jane Austen every year, whatever you are, is because new things emerge and they can't be translated. So I think you're exactly right, yes. Right.
Well, I know there are more questions in the audience, but we have run out of time. I just wanted to make a comment on the last line there about Jane Austen. Gilbert Ryle was once asked if he reads novels, to which he replied, yes, all 6 every year. A humane man. So if you enjoyed this evening's talk, you should most certainly come back next term when we're going to have 3 more talks in this ongoing series organised by the Humane Philosophy Project and the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. You might be particularly interested to come to our final talk, which is by Hubert Dreyfus, and he's going to tell us about how Dostoevsky teaches us how to save the sacred from science, so something extremely relevant to tonight's topic. Do please stay and have some more refreshments before you eventually leave this evening, but before that, please thank once again our speaker for this evening for an extremely interesting talk.